Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's so great to welcome each of you to this evening. This is the third in this series, Journeys to Justice, which is jointly sponsored by the affirming committees of Claremont United and Goodwood United Churches. Our featured guest speaker tonight is Dr. Dianne Saxe. Our moderator, Reverend Lionel Ketela, will fully introduce her in a minute, but let me just start by saying that hearing her speak a few years ago at the annual general meeting of the Land Over Landings organization started me on my own path into climate activism. To start, I want to acknowledge that we are all seated on lands which remain home to a number of Indigenous nations and people whose relationship with the land remains central to their lives. May we all awaken to new opportunities to walk in justice and reconciliation with the first people of this land. And a short prayer to start. Creator God, source of all that is, bless all who have gathered here tonight to listen and learn. May we be people of peace who live from a place of justice and join our voices with others who want to give birth to new ways of being in this world. Amen. And I'm going to hand us over to Reverend Lionel Ketela right now as our moderator, but at the beginning, I'm going to ask that we all take our videos off and stay muted so that it's to be less distracting for the speaker. Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Lionel Ketela, the minister serving at both Goodwood and Claremont United Churches. And it's a privilege to be here tonight and to have the opportunity to introduce our third guest speaker in our series, Dr. Dianne Saxe. So Dr. Dianne is an internationally recognized Canadian climate lawyer, rated among the top 25 environmental lawyers in the world. Dr. Saxe was the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario from 2015 to 2019 and is currently Deputy Leader of the Green Party of Ontario. Known for her role as an activist and her work in government and private practice, she was appointed to the position of Environmental Commissioner of Ontario in 2015 for a 5-year term. And during that term, Dr. Saxe delivered 17 widely used reports to the legislature on topics including everything from environmental injustice to First Nations, endangered species, water pollution and climate policy, and many more. The Conservative government elected in 2018 took strong exception to her critique of their rolling back Ontario's climate change laws. And soon afterwards, they announced that her position would be abolished by legislation, and some of its functions transferred to the Auditor General. So after 25 years, that position has ceased to exist. Then Dr. Saxe reopened her environmental law practice, focused on climate issues. She publishes articles and a blog, hosts a podcast called Green Economy Heroes, and presents on climate issues to a number of groups. Dr. Saxe is a recipient of numerous awards, including a 2020 Law Society Medal for exemplary leadership in environmental law. So Dr. Dianne, it is a privilege to welcome you tonight. It's wonderful to have you with us. And Dianne will be speaking with us for 30 minutes. And during that time, if you have questions you would like to share, you're welcome to go into chat and enter your questions in chat. And after Dianne has spoken for 30 minutes, I will share those questions for response from Dianne. So thank you for being with us, and we'll hand it over to you.
Okay, well, I hope you, thank you very much for the lovely introduction. Do you see the slides on your screen?
Yes, we can.
And hopefully you only see one slide. Yes?
Yeah, just one slide.
Perfect. Okay, it's always hard to tell. Anyway, thank you very much. So in half an hour, I'm going to be going through a skip and a jump very quickly through some of the high points of climate change, but obviously I'll be glad to take questions afterwards. So these are the key things that I'm going to talk about. You folks know, I hope, that we are giving the world a fever. We have the highest recorded ever level of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, the highest level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We're blowing away temperature records year after year. You can see this on the picture here. The medium red is showing places in the world that are much warmer than average, which is, you can see most of the world. The darker red is record warmest. We've been blowing away temperature records all around the world. And very few places are colder than average. And basically what you're seeing there is the ice caps melting and the ocean currents being slowed down. In addition, greenhouse gases, well, particularly carbon dioxide, it dissolves into water and creates carbonic acid. So it's making the oceans more acidic, and that making life more difficult for anything that needs to pull calcium out of the water to make a skeleton, which includes a lot of the creatures that make the atmosphere, make the oxygen that we breathe. So easiest way to think about this is we're giving the world a fever. Now, my experience, I've been an environmental and energy lawyer for 45 years, and my experience is that when people get bad news, whether it's medical or professional or losing a job, whatever, generally people want to hang on for normal to come back. And what I need you to understand, you can see on this chart, is by normal, we usually mean roughly the average of the 20th century. That's what our laws are designed for. It's what our insurance is mostly designed for. It's what our culverts are designed for. And I hope you can see that we don't live there anymore. And it's not likely to come back anytime in our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes, because there's a long lag between the time that we put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the impact on the temperature that you can see here. Now, you do hear people say on the radio or talking about, well, the weather's really strange. And they talk about new normal. Well, we are got nowhere near a new normal. New normal is you put on 10 pounds and you buy a new pair of pants, right? That's when you think you're going to be staying at that new weight and you'll be able to wear the new pair of pants. Well, I hope you can see that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, this is measured in Hawaii at the top of a mountain. It's a pretty good approximation for what carbon dioxide is in the whole atmosphere. And you can see from this chart, it's been going up faster and faster every decade. So that rather than being at a new normal, we're reaching the point where really we're at the end of normal and we're going into uncharted territory. So it means when, not if. These are all pictures from Ontario while I was environmental commissioner, but you can get these pictures from almost anywhere in the world. Just think of the pictures you've seen from BC recently, almost anywhere. So you probably know that in 1992, all of the countries of the world agreed to a treaty, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Based on the science that was known in the 1980s, we all agreed, all the countries, that we would keep global average temperature rise in the 21st century below 2 degrees. And that was because the science was really clear already 4 decades ago that if we went past 2 degrees, we would put the basis for civilization at risk. Now, by 2015, we hadn't done anything of the kind. As you saw from the CO2 chart, our climate pollution has got worse and worse and worse over that period of time. But it was starting to become clear that 2 degrees isn't safe. And so in 2015, again, all the countries of the world, every country in the world agreed that we would keep the global average temperature this century well below 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5. And since that time, we've had really important work done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Anytime that people tell you they don't know who to believe, they're not paying attention, because it's really clear who we should believe. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the volunteer work of thousands upon thousands of the world's best scientists contributing their expertise so that the governments of the world have a solid factual basis. So it's really clear who to believe. We believe the IPCC, and what they have told us is that there's a huge difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. Large, widespread, robust differences. But the critical difference is that if we could keep temperature increase this century, which is during the lifetime of today's children, if we could keep that to 1.5 degrees, then probably most human and natural systems will be able to adapt. But once we get past 1.5, that ability to adapt starts to break down. More and more systems become brittle and will break explosively and unpredictably. Well, where are we headed? Well, as you can see, we're not headed anywhere near staying in 1.5. A lot of pledges have been made in international meetings, but by and large, countries aren't keeping them. And certainly Canada is one of the worst. We make promises and never keep them. But as you can see from this chart, right now we're on track to 3.5 or more degrees this century, which is far, far, far beyond anything that any human society has ever had to cope with before, or that we have any idea how to cope. This is one cartoon that you can think about what's coming our way. Now, it's important to understand that Canada is not an innocent bystander. I hear a lot of Canadians say, well, you know, we're a small country, our emissions don't matter. And it's just not true. It's not just that our per capita emissions are some of the worst in the entire world. We burn more coal and oil and gas and generally create more climate pollution than almost all the people in the entire world. But it's also true that even though we have a small population of perhaps 38 million people, of the nearly 200 countries in the world, we're one of the worst. And we are absolutely the worst in the G7, certainly per capita. So, while other countries have reduced their climate pollution in the last few years, and particularly since Paris, we have not. So how close are we already to passing 1.5? And I'd encourage you to watch and see how much of the space between to reaching 1.5 has been used up in your lifetime. And that just goes to last year. This is another cartoon that puts it all pretty simply. So who suffers the most from this? Well, this is where I'm glad that you're thinking about climate in terms of your social justice journey, because whatever you care about, hunger, war and peace, disease, inequality, nature, the Middle East, whatever you care about, the climate crisis makes it harder to manage. It increases the threats, it decreases our ability to cope. And there are examples from all over the world. I mean, the floods in Bangladesh, which floods over and over again, are just one example. But we do know that just like COVID, vulnerable people everywhere in the world suffer the most. Vulnerable people in rich countries suffer more than other people in rich countries. Vulnerable people in poor countries suffer much more than people in rich countries. Anywhere in the world that you look, people who are already vulnerable suffer the most. Hunger is a really well-documented example, and this is from the World Food Program. And here's one of the stats that the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, has looked at is what's going to happen, what do we think is going to happen to crops this century? And you can see blue is crops that are going to increase in yield, and some will, but look at the ones that are going to decrease. And this data is already from a study published in 2014. It's already nearly a decade old, and increasingly things are worse and getting worse faster than scientists thought they would even just a few years ago. We know that one of the biggest impacts is on health. The World Health Organization has reported repeatedly that climate change is one of the biggest, or the biggest global health threat this century, and that the benefits in terms of health far outweigh the cost of meeting climate goals, often estimated to be twice as much. So if we count health, if we value health, then the health benefits are going to more than pay for what it would cost us to get off fossil fuels. One of the ways we can think about that here, so this is a picture of air pollution in Toronto. I worked with Professor Marianne Hatzapolo at the University of Toronto this summer to again measure air impacts from fossil fuel vehicles across the city. And this is just a small excerpt from her study. But what you can see is that there are parts of the city where walking along the street is quite safe from an air quality point of view. So anything where you see in green, that's where the air quality is pretty good. So if you look in Rosedale, you'll see the air quality is pretty good. In Rosedale, there's not that many cars, there's lots of trees. But the red and the black are indicating areas where the air quality is so bad that it's a serious threat to human health, and that's all coming from fossil fuel vehicles. And what we know is that the air quality tends to be the worst in poorer areas of the city, and in particular in the area, for example, in the northwest of Toronto, where you also had the highest levels of COVID. Some of that is interrelated. We know that people who breathe dirty air, their lungs are less well able to deal with COVID, and they have a whole series of other health impacts that go throughout their lives. We also know that traffic-related air pollution is correlated with increased levels of dementia, increased levels of learning difficulty. You also have noise along these roads, which interferes with people's ability to hear and to learn. So wherever we are in the world, we can see that burning fossil fuels has huge impacts on everything we care about, and so much of our lives would be better if we stopped. Many other impacts, certainly in Canada, it's really obvious how First Nations communities tend to suffer the most from climate change. It's just not a coincidence that Lytton, BC, which burned to the ground earlier this year, was a First Nations community, that many of the communities that have been forced to evacuate because of floods and fire in Ontario have been First Nations communities. But for everyone, well, one of the things we pride ourselves about and for in Canada is peace, order, and good government, but we really have to say that that is not guaranteed. That large-scale uneven impacts of climate change may destabilize a whole range of existing institutional arrangements, increase incentives to violently redistribute wealth, or generate other forms of social conflict. And we see this happening around the world. You can see the struggles over immigration, and we know that already there are many, many millions of people who've been displaced by climate chaos, and with every degree of temperature increase, we can expect another billion people to be forced to move because they can't feed their families anymore, and that creates conflict. We can see what's happened in Europe with the battle over immigration. We can see it in the United States with their southern border, and we're starting to get a bit of a taste of it ourselves. When you put it all together, the special rapporteur to the United Nations Human Rights Council summarized it this way, that this century, which means in the lifetime of today's children, the best case is widespread death and suffering, and the worst case is humanity on the brink of extinction. So there really aren't any bigger stakes. And that's why I'm devoting my life to working on solutions for this climate crisis. I think if we get it wrong, nothing much else is going to matter. And yes, the most vulnerable will suffer the most and first, but no one is safe. Just as with COVID, no one is safe. No one is safe in a world with this kind of destruction and suffering. So climate justice is a phrase we hear a lot about, and here's a commonly heard definition: that climate justice begins with recognizing that key groups are differently affected, and in particular that climate impacts exacerbate inequitable social conditions. And again, we see that in the First Nations, who generally live in poor land, often flood-prone land, because that's where the reserves were put. and where they don't have the social capital, the infrastructure, the finance to be able to protect themselves or go elsewhere. And there is increasing demand for climate justice solutions. And you probably heard some of the fury actually in Glasgow that rich countries are not prepared to pay up, to offer money to compensate poorer countries for loss and damage, even though the loss and damage is becoming more and more obvious. And it's really clear that, generally speaking, poor countries have contributed little to climate damage, rich countries have contributed most, and the bill is being paid by people in poor countries in Bangladesh and the Philippines and other places that are flooding and burning. So, well, is it too late? The good news is that although we are in for really big changes already, we are already seeing really big changes, there is still a little time to avoid the worst, and our choices matter right now. And of course, in Ontario, they're going to matter in the provincial election in June. The great good news is that there is so much to gain. So you probably recognize this slide of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which were selected by the United Nations as a way of summarizing the kind of world that we would like to create. And many of the changes that we need to make to deal with climate can also help make the other Sustainable Development Goals easier to reach and more successful. So we have an opportunity to avoid catastrophe, but also really to create a better world that we ourselves would benefit from. I mentioned already the health benefits far outweigh the costs of meeting climate change. So whenever anybody tells you that, well, dealing with climate costs too much, that means they're not valuing your health at all, or their children's health. We also know that there are opportunities everywhere. So Project Drawdown, which some of you I hope have heard of, it's a great piece of research on where there are the best, most cost-effective, most efficient opportunities for reducing climate damage and increasing our resilience. And as you can see, I hope, there are opportunities everywhere. There are opportunities in buildings, in transport, in industry, in food, in electricity, in land sinks, in land restoration, in the oceans. So the great good news is that whatever you're working on or interested in, there is an opportunity there to do something to reduce climate damage and increase our resilience and our ability to cope with climate chaos and the hammer blows that are coming our way. We've also got great Canadian innovators. I know it was mentioned in the introduction. I have this podcast called Green Economy Heroes, and I do the podcast because I'm looking for hope, and it's really exciting. I've interviewed more than 67 green business leaders already, Canadians who are running businesses that reduce our carbon footprint, big businesses, little businesses, all ages and genders in different parts of the country. And it's exciting to see how many ideas, how many opportunities, how many ways there are to build a better future and give us a better chance of surviving what's coming. Because really where we are now, as you heard, I hope this summer, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued the first part of their 6th assessment report. Every few years, they issue a massive wrap up. And this summer was the physical state of the science, and which, as the secretary put it, is code red. We are facing code red. We are in code red. But we could have a better future. And so I spent a lot of this year writing this roadmap to net zero, which is the Ontario Greens climate plan, which I hope you'll look at. You can find it on my website, Vote for Dianne, or on the Green Party website. And we really do still have a practical, achievable path to better health, cleaner air, cleaner water, more social equity, and a stable climate if we got at it now. But there sure isn't any time to waste. Because we know the basics. We really do know what to do. We have to crush climate pollution. We've reached the point now that if we want a stable future, we've got to be cutting our climate pollution roughly in half every decade. And I hope you're not hearing the children in the background, but anyway, there are children in the background. The second thing we have to do is to protect water and nature and its ability to protect us. because we need the wetlands, the woodlands, the natural ecosystems that our lives depend on. And the third thing we have to do is find ways to succeed together. We can't just leave more and more people behind. We're not going to get social peace that way. And without social cohesion, we're not going to be able to hold together under what's coming. We won't be able to make the changes we need to make. So how do we get it done? Well, the simplest thing is we need to take action. Action feels a lot better than anxiety. And there are so many opportunities to take actions. I mean, COVID made it harder to get together with other people, but it's getting easier now to get together with other people, and we're finding more and more ways to do things electronically, such as this way. Personal footprint matters for sure. What you do with your own life, with what you do with your own savings, transport, housing, investment, nutrition, consumption. The very last document that I released as environmental commissioner, one day before my office was silenced, was on the personal carbon footprint of individual Ontarians. And what we know is that for the average Ontarian, half of their climate pollution comes from just four things. Driving, we drive the most polluting vehicles in the entire world. Heating leaky houses with fossil fuels. Flying, this was obviously before COVID, and eating beef, which has a huge carbon footprint. We didn't in this report look at what people do with their money, their savings, and their pensions, but that's also tremendously important. But the key thing is that we can't solve climate crisis through individual action. And when you see the gas company, Shell and so on saying, okay, what are you doing? You know, they're just trying to duck responsibility for what they've created. Individual action, among other things, is powerfully directed and limited by what the public has done, what infrastructure choices are there, what public policy is there, what tax policy is there. Collective problems need collective action, and that's why government was invented. And the only tools that big tools that we have are to make polluters pay, to invest in solutions, and to regulate. Oops, I don't know why this is moving by itself. And government will do this if we elect climate champions and not if we don't. As you might have seen, Ontario had a lot to be proud of until the Ford government was elected. And since then, on energy, environment, and climate, almost everything has been going backwards, and in really serious ways, and especially urban sprawl. The Ford government is turbocharging urban sprawl and attempting to lock in sprawl for the next 3 decades in ways that will be really, really difficult to undo. So what can we do? Well, one thing we can all do is to speak up for the future that we want. And Ed Maybach gave us these simple rules to learn by, 11 magic words, which I'm going to urge you to memorize. Maybe say it back with me. Simple, clear messages, repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. Simple, clear messages, repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. And you can see the sticker up on the right. Do you remember when Ford was forcing gas stations to post stickers that didn't stick, that lied about the federal carbon price? And so they did these stickers to remind people that there's a carbon dividend. Most families get more back from the federal carbon price than they pay. So thinking of simple ways to get that message across, this is one of the things they did. There's many different ways to do it. I'm looking for hope. And the only recipe that I know for hope is this one: knowledge. For sure, we have to start with what we know is true, but we can't stop there, because if we stop only by knowing what's true, it can be overwhelming. The only way to get past despair is to find other people and take action with them. And a religious institution is the perfect place to have a moral conversation and to find like-minded people to take action with. So this is my best advice: find other people to take action with. No one can do everything, but everyone can do something. This is Sophia Mather. When she was just 9 years old, she decided to take action on climate. She was the first child in North America to join Greta Thunberg's school strike, and she has been working ever since. And she's been able to make an enormous difference to inspire the adults around her to take action. So it's not going to be easy, but it is going to be worth it. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Now let's just check chat and see what questions we have that came up.
We don't have anything just yet, but
Oh, okay. So we have a moment if you'd like to enter some questions that you would like Dianne to respond to. That would be wonderful. But I thought thank you, first of all, for the information that you shared. And I think that from the way that you took us from the predicament as well to opportunities for collective action and talking about knowledge plus action equals hope. And one of the things that came to mind for me are in your work and advocacy, have you been aware of examples of faith communities that are working in partnership with other organizations around climate change and doing hopeful things? If there are any that you can share with us.
Oh, I had some slides that I had to squeeze out in order to keep the presentation short, but there definitely are faith communities doing interesting things. One of the slides I really like to use is a church that put a cross on their roof in solar panels. So anybody who goes by that building knows instantly two critical things about that building and that community. First of all, the cross shows the religious affiliation, but secondly, that they're turning their faith into action because they're doing something about their emissions by putting solar panels on their roof. I know that there are a number of well, I can talk about my own religious community because that's the one that I know the best. One of the things that we did was we started a community supported agriculture group. Do you have anything like that?
Not that
sorry,
I'm.
I didn't hear that. I was looking up something for the United
sorry.
Church.
Yeah, one of the things that we did was start a community supported agriculture group so that local farmers can sell directly to synagogue members. So for many farmers, it's growing the food is hard, but what's really hard is getting the financing and knowing for sure that they're going to have customers. So a community supported agriculture group, you get together a certain number of people in the community and everybody puts up money at the beginning of the year. And that gives the farmers enough money to buy the seeds and the fertilizer and plant their crops. And then every week during the growing season, they would bring a truck to the synagogue and set a little, basically a little booth out in front of the synagogue, and people would come and pick up their week's fruits and vegetables, everything that was grown with their money. So you get different things in June than you get in October, but you get whatever is the absolute freshest, and it's grown responsibly. It was grown without pesticides. It was grown locally, provided money to keep farmland instead of growing houses. And so food is a really important way that we can help support both local businesses, support our local landscape, and get really, really, really good quality food from people that we know who they are. So that's one thing. Certainly, if you can think about how people get to church. So I gave a talk for Faith in the Common Good, a couple of them actually in Hamilton. And one of the things that they have there is a program for basically going to church with a friend, so that you don't have to have everybody driving themselves to church, that you can have a buddy and basically carpool to church. And what they found was that people liked the additional connection, like having somebody to go to church with was more friendly, and people were more likely to actually go to church if they had a buddy. And so what it started as a way of reducing mileage, it actually became a real benefit to their interconnection within the community.
They're
anyway,
wonderful examples.
There's also a church in Toronto that's spent a lot, it's a name I'm not coming up with at this moment, who has spent a lot of time putting food gardens on their land. And I see this in a number of churches, so that they can use the land that they have to grow food and share that food with people who need it. And also, it's a good activity. A lot of people really like growing food and don't have a place they're in an apartment or whatever, don't have anywhere to grow. So getting together again with other people in the church to grow food and know it's going to a good cause, that also helps make people happier and helps deal directly with some of the local problems that we have. Anything that you can do to make your building more efficient. So Faith in the Common Good had a Greening Sacred Spaces program for a number of years. For churches tend to be really expensive to heat. And that's often quite a burden if the population, if the church community is small. So if you can make the building more efficient so that you don't need nearly as much heat, and especially if you can then generate some of their own heat with solar panels or whatever, that can make the operating costs less expensive, make the building easier to sustain and more comfortable and less polluting. So you have lots of options.
That's really helpful to hear. It's Steve here beside Lionel, and the United Church of Canada, which Lionel and I are ministers in, and has something called the United Property Resource Corporation. And sadly, a lot of our churches are closing just from decline. But so there's all of this property, and the property's slowly being developed, but all with renewable resources now. And it's really important that they do that. So right now in the region that I'm involved in, we have 7 properties, most of them around Toronto, but also up as far as Aurelia. And they're working that way, and they're going to be wonderful, low-income housing as well, but with some amazing sustainable architecture. So we're very excited to be doing that. So that's an important part as well. So thanks for that.
That sounds great. And if you have church officials traveling to visit constituents or visit members or going to funerals or whatever, like what are they getting there in? You can set a really good example by how you get around. If you're going in a gas guzzler, you're sending a message.
That's right.
That's right.
So there's Tim.
Thank you so much. I've been looking at the chat a little bit and stop the phone. There we go. And one of the questions is that they're wondering if you could comment on regenerative agriculture.
Well, regenerative agriculture is a really important opportunity, and it's actually one of the exciting stories. So I mentioned the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change a couple of times. They did 3 special reports in 2019, and one of them was specifically on land. And what they've shown is we have degraded an enormous amount of soil around the world, and rebuilding that soil give us the opportunity not only to take a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere, but also to repair a lot of the damage that we've done. So one example that I mentioned in our climate plan roadmap to net zero is biochar. I don't know if you've heard of biochar, but we need to be able to take carbon out of the atmosphere, and we need to be able to take it out of the atmosphere in a way that stays out. A lot of people want to plant trees. There's great things about planting trees, but we can't have any particular confidence that trees are going to live at least 100 years now that we're in an age of megafires. But what we can do is, if you have surplus organic material, wood from fast-growing trees that have been cut not without damaging old-growth forests, then pyrolyzing that, basically heating it in the absence of oxygen, you end up with a very fine-grained material that is a lot like charcoal, but without the volatiles in it. And if you then make compost with it or mix it with compost and dig it into the ground, you enormously improve the fertility of the soil, and you create carbon in a form that will stay in the soil for very long periods of time. The archaeologists have found biochar that was buried 2,000 years ago still in the soil, still providing its function of supporting soil life. So that's just one example of a way that we really can address the problems we've created both in the soil and with carbon, and create soil that is more resilient to floods and droughts and grows better quality food. So I put some in my garden this year. At least it's a place to start.
Thank you. And another question I'm seeing says, Oh, it's more, yeah. Why doesn't the government or big business get it? What's it going to take to change them?
Well, a lot of big business is starting to get it. Um, the, as you know, we just had a big international meeting at Glasgow. And although the governments of the world didn't get very far, there were a lot of interesting side deals made. And a lot of businesses were competing to say, actually, we can do things. So I heard a very interesting talk, for example, from Anglo American, a giant mining company. And what they were saying, or at least what their CEO was saying, is this is a really precious opportunity for us. It doesn't often happen that a business gets permission to make major changes that aren't going to pay off instantly. But we've got that opportunity right now. And their estimate is that they can reduce their costs about 30% and slice their carbon footprint. But it will take a few years for it all to pay back. And they didn't have permission to make those kinds of changes before, but now they do, and they're doing it. And they're finding that it works really well and that they can reimagine their assets. So one of the things that they realize is they have a mining company, they have a lot of land, they have a lot of places they can put solar and wind. One of the big challenges with solar and wind is to how to store the electricity. What they have is they have a lot of old flooded mines, which normally are a liability, but which they can then use basically for pump storage, that when you got extra wind, you pump the water out of the mine into a reservoir, and when you need the electricity, you let the water fall back down into the mine. So they've been able to take something that was just costing them money and turn it into something where they can make money. So Microsoft has pledged not only to be net zero, but to positively offset everything they've ever emitted. And we see a number of big companies recognizing that there's a multi-trillion-dollar growth opportunity here. Mark Carney put together a coalition of financial asset managers who between them manage, wait for it, 130 trillion US dollars at Glasgow, all of whom pledged to change their investment criteria, not only to reach net zero by 2050, but to do their fair share of reductions this decade, and to have 5-year plans and to be tracking their impact. And so that one of the things that that's doing is it means that there is a vast amount of money now scouring the world looking for really good green investment opportunities. I had Tom Rand on my podcast, and I interviewed him again recently, and he was saying that 3 years ago, when he was putting together his fund to invest in climate solutions, they really had to scrape and dig to get a few $100 million to get started with. And now that there's hundreds of billions chasing these kinds of investments. So lots of the big folks are getting it and are moving. Now, unfortunately, Ontario was really well positioned in 2018 to be attracting that kind of money. And then the Ford government kicked international clean energy investors and anyone who invested in our cap and trade system in the teeth and left millions and millions of dollars of losses around the world. And so, and besides has all these very destructive policies. So we're not well placed right now, but we could be again.
Thank you. And another question here. Someone says, I've been hearing about the massive carbon footprint needed to make wind turbines, car batteries, etc. Could you comment on feasible solutions there?
Yeah, so what you're hearing mostly is misinformation.
Oh.
The carbon footprint of making renewable energy equipment is tiny compared to the benefits they provide during their operating lifetimes. In the same way that there's a lot of energy to get used to make a car, but it's tiny in comparison to the impact that the car has driving around when you burn gasoline. Most of the attacks on solar and wind are coming from those who benefit from the status quo. there definitely are some legitimate issues. I wrote a report in 2018 on the electricity system in Ontario. And so if you're interested in that sort of thing, I put all the stats there. There is no form of generating electricity or other forms of energy that has zero impacts. But the impacts of renewable energy are tiny compared to the impacts of fossil. And a lot of the problems that people said, okay, what are we going to do about are being solved. So for example, this isn't particular to wind and solar, but you think about lithium ion batteries. So if you have I have a cell phone here, I have a computer, I've got lots of things that have lithium ion batteries in them. And those lithium ion batteries, until very recently, we didn't have any way to deal with. They were basically just would go to into slag. And that's ridiculous because we really need that lithium. It's going to be an increasingly precious resource. So one of the companies that I interviewed on my podcast was a lithium ion recycling company that came up, in Canadian invention, came up with a safe way of separating lithium and the other important metals out of lithium ion batteries so that they can be reused again. And it's now a world leader on exactly that. So we do have some problems we have to solve, and they are being solved, and they're being solved by really good innovation. One other thing I would say about carbon footprint is that both wind and solar have gone not only an exponential decrease in cost, just an enormous decrease in cost, but also an enormous increase in efficiency. So the material footprint in comparison to the energy produced is getting better and better and better, faster and faster every year. There's lots of opportunity for more improvements there, and every generation gets better.
Thank you.
Just to thank you, and just to note, like to a previous comment you were talking about, it's interesting. I'm aware of a small but growing number of churches that are also looking at their investments. And that's a big area in terms of environmental and investments that reflect social justice. So there is thankfully a small but growing movement of churches which are doing that, which is great. And
Yes.
one more question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so let me recommend an article. In September 2019, Bill McKibben, who has been prescient on climate issues for many years, wrote a fabulous article called "Money is the Oxygen on Which the Fire of Global Warming Burns." And his point there was that fighting the fossil fuel companies is no longer the most important thing to do. The most important thing to do is to get financial institutions to stop funding them, and that's a much more winnable fight. So absolutely, what you do with your investments is tremendously important. What your church does with its pension fund, tremendously important. Wherever, I mean, if you're banking with a big bank, then well, those big banks, the Canadian big banks, are all still funding fossil fuel expansion, even since the Paris Agreement. They're making the future worse. They're actively making the future worse. So if it's possible for you to get your money out of a Canadian bank and into a credit union or Desjardins or someone who's behaving better in climate, if they can meet your financial needs, then that's an important thing to do. If you have to stay with a big bank, at least you should be talking to your bank manager and telling them how unhappy you are and that you're looking for other options. You need to get those messages across. Most of us are either paying into or getting something from the Canadian pension plan. Canadian pension plan has a terrible, terrible carbon footprint. So again, you could do something useful by writing letters to protest to the managers of the whatever pension plan you're in. If you want to learn more about how to be more effective on your pension plan, there's an NGO called Shift Action. You can search them at shiftaction.ca, and they do free training for folks like you who want to learn how to be more effective in persuading financial institutions to clean up their act. And that's important for our climate future, but it's also important financially because fossil fuels are really a bad a bad bet. They've lost money compared to the rest of the financial market over the last many years and are likely to continue to do so. So both for the safety of your pensions and for the safety of our kids, we need to make them change. And they will only do so if they hear from enough people.
Thank you. One person is asking, what can parents and grandparents say and do to raise environmentally responsible children?
Well, I'm trying to do that, that's for sure. I have 5 grandchildren, and that's one of the reasons why I'm thrown myself into politics, Lord help me. Because I can't look them in the eye unless I do everything that I can. The climate crisis is really scary. There's no question about it. It is scary. It should be scary. We are mucking with the systems on which we depend. I mean, the best metaphor that I have for this is if you think about being on an escalator, and that escalator, at the top of the escalator, we can see there's a raging fire that we just do not want to get into. In 1992, when we signed, and all the countries of the world signed the the Treaty on Climate Change at the Earth Summit, getting off the escalator was just a level step. It was dead easy. We didn't do it. If we had gone off the escalator 10 years later, at the beginning of this century, it would have been a big step, but it would still have been pretty easy. At this point, it's a jump. It's a bit of a scary jump to get off the escalator, but if we don't get off it, then we're going to end up with really unpleasant choices. So I think that, I mean, the only thing I know for kids is the same thing I know for adults. Is we need action. Being able to take action with others feels better than climate despair. And the more we know about the facts, in many respects, the more frightening it is. And so we have to then take that knowledge and match it with action and helping kids get involved. I mean, the great thing about the marches and the school strikes is it gives kids things to do with other kids. We've seen lots of, we know that kids speaking up makes a difference. And let me tell you 2 stories that I know of where kids have really made a difference. The first one was a group of grade 3s. They wrote, they were encouraged by their teacher, who I met, to influence a vote at local council. And there was one counselor who was standing up for the thing that they wanted to support. And so each and every one of them made a handmade Valentine and sent it to that counselor to thank him for standing up for whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And 3 years later, he was still remembered it and still stood up in public and talked about it, how much that touched him, that he'd got these handwritten Valentines from each of the kids in the grade 3 class. And so that was still strengthening and encouraging him to make the kinds of go out on limbs and to take positions in council that he might have been a little shy to do before. A second example that I can give you is the city of Sudbury. I mentioned Sophia Mather and the things she's done in Sudbury. Well, the city of Sudbury passed a climate emergency declaration and adopted a strong climate action policy. And they did it because, in large part, that young people stood up. And in fact, what I'm told is that when the climate emergency declaration came to council, there was a large deputation of young people who went to council and were sitting in the chairs watching how the councilors voted. And then they all voted unanimously for the climate emergency declaration. I don't think that would have happened if the kids hadn't been there. Mm-hmm. So kids speaking up matters, even in small groups and in terms of big groups. I mentioned the $130 trillion of financial assets. So the largest single financial manager in the world is a guy named Larry Fink. He runs BlackRock. He manages, wait for it, $9 trillion US. Oh. That's real money. And he writes a letter every year to the CEOs of the big companies of the world, the people who are competing for his money. And he has changed his position to make climate an important investment criteria. And he said one of the reasons he did it was because of all the kids in the street standing up, showing up, speaking up, and for the kind of future that they wanted. So what young people do matters. Help them find a way to find something to do and support them doing it. That's the best advice I've got.
What about things like bullfrog power? I started putting in. It's not very expensive, and I would just, it's something I've looked at for a long time, and I feel that I'm doing something by even with the small amount I give every month. But is that a kind of a good thing to encourage things? Because I know even as our churches, we could offset part of our carbon by just paying the $40 a month to Bullfrog Power, which is trying to do some really great stuff behind the scenes. So.
Brilliant idea. I absolutely recommend it. I do it myself. I've been a member of Bullfrog Power for basically since they started. But yes, it's particularly important for offsetting the gas you use in the building. So we know that the gas that's used to heat buildings is methane. When it comes from fossil gas, well, it's worsening the climate crisis. When it comes from captured landfill gas, it's not. And so Bullfrog pays for collection of landfill gas, places where it's not legally required, and that's what goes into to displace fossil gas. And so that's what I use to heat my house too. So it's a very easy thing to do. They're doing good projects, and it's worth supporting them. And as you say, it's easy. It's better to also find ways to reduce your consumption in making the building more efficient, for example. But in the meantime, paying Bullfrog is a really easy thing to do, and they're good people doing good things.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And write them and thank them. Right? Everybody who's doing good things needs a thank you, and often they don't get it. So if you get an opportunity to support the people who are doing good things, that can make a difference too.
Sure.
And certainly reflects as well just the importance of the public dimension of the public voice of the church in lending that support, right?
Mhm.
Around these important justice issues.
Right. So you remember I said simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. So churches have trusted voices. And it's really important for you to be using that voice. One of the ongoing mysteries around the world is we have religious leaders, and I know I showed a picture of the Pope he's issued his encyclical, and he talks about climate, but we have the similar kind of statements by religious leaders of many faiths. And yet we don't see very much climate leadership from faith communities on the ground, certainly not in North America.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really understand why, because it's a important religious value in every religion that I know of to care for creation and to provide a good future for children and grandchildren. And we can't do that unless we deal with climate. So I hope you will find ways to use the religious, the moral leadership that you have and the explicit permission that you have to talk about morality and shared values in the long term. There aren't enough people thinking about and talking about the long term, and churches can do that. So you've got some real strengths. I hope you'll use them.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, I could have you be with us here all night, but I am conscious of the fact that it's just a little past 8:30, and I wanted to say thank you so very much for sharing your little bits of your wisdom, because I know there's so much more that you could have shown us and said and spoken about. I hope that we will all go away remembering that we need simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. And that we also take away, and I thank you for the phrase that knowledge plus action equals hope. It's like, it could be a mantra, a beacon, so that when there are discouraging days, we can say, you know what, knowledge plus action equals hope. So thank you so much, Dianne.
Thank you. And I would encourage everyone, please do check out our climate plan, the roadmap to net zero. I just put it in the chat. we really can have better lives by doing what will also give us a stable future. So why wouldn't we want that? And in a lot of ways, it'll save us money too. So we don't need to bet the planet on magic. We have the technology we need. We just need to get together and do it. So thank you so much. I hope to hear what you get up to.
We will let you know. Thank you very,
you.
very much.